Well, this, as you can see, is called the role of localism and intergroup dialogue, how bottom-up solutions create more peace in Cote d'Ivoire. And the question is the average probability of communal violence lower in localities where UN peacekeepers organize intergroup dialogue activities as opposed to in localities where UN peacekeepers do not organize intergroup dialogue activities? So basically examining the role of these organized intergroup dialogue activities on communal violence in these local communities. And the methods through which they examined this were studying monthly information on UN peacekeepers intergroup dialogue activities across 107 departments in this country, Cote d'Ivoire, between October 2011 and May 2016. So it seems like they had a very large sample pool of documentation to kind of draw their conclusions from, which is good for validity of the results. They relied on 8,302 French and English press releases published between January of May 2006 and May 2016 in order to capture accurately these local intergroup activities. Again, good for validity of the study results. They essentially tried to observe some of the 777 intergroup activities carried out by the United Nations peacekeeping operations in Cote d'Ivoire in several towns and villages. I think this is interesting, just how in-depth they went into to really try and figure out and paint a detailed picture of these different dialogue activities that were happening. Something that I notice a lot of times, particularly in studies that include foreign countries, is that we'll take like one context or like one study or one documentation or like one example of something and draw a conclusion from it, as opposed to really fleshing out the documentation. And so seeing like these 8,000 press releases and these 777 intergroup activities and like these 107 departments, to me is really promising for whatever the results are going to be. So yeah, we can move on to the next slide.
Well, may I just add? So it's interesting that you pointed that out, Alyssa, because when I'm listening to you and I'm reading this, and my thoughts were actually going in the opposite direction of how one-sided this like the actual evidence, so to say, or the methods seem to be, because it's all coming from press releases and what the UN peacekeepers do rather than what
from the people in the country.
Yeah, like what the community is doing and receiving.
I agree with you. I think it's very detailed on one perspective. Like it's very detailed for the French and the English, and in terms of like the effectiveness or the long-term results for the people in these communities, I'm not really seeing a lot of data on that. So I completely agree with it. It's actually a very funny observation. It's very detailed for like one group, like one perspective, which I feel like is something we see in a lot of research studies. Noah, you were about to say something?
No, it just makes me think of how this could be a biased result too. Like just saying, if it's just coming from them, if it's coming from their work, like of course their intergroup dialogue is going to make a big difference.
Yeah, it's going to be super effective in resolving conflict. Yeah, and particularly because it's the UN, I just know, like historically speaking, they are not always the most effective group when it comes to resolving conflict. I don't know which particular conflict they were working on in Cote d'Ivoire, but I know from like being an intermajor and reading about like the UN peacekeepers, and like Rwanda, for example, is a very popular example of like them not really being effective. I don't know, like, you know, scaling everything obviously is important, but I definitely agree with both of you how this is like very slanted. There's a lot of documentation, but the documentation itself is coming from one group. So let's see how we feel that impacts the results. So of course, helped decrease communal violence. Primarily intergroup dialogue activities helped create opportunities for community leaders of different groups to discuss local conflict issues, often with the help of direct mediation by peacekeepers. These activities accelerated intergroup information and sharing and coordination, basically facilitating better ways of communicating so that social order was maintained locally. If there were conflicts, they were communicated better, and that as a whole helped decrease communal violence, allegedly. And the takeaways from this are that you should choose approachability over authority and work on building intercultural empathy. So on the last part, that basically means that employees can always be expected to act mindfully without being given the tools to show such behavior regularly. So you have a set of expectations as a boss or as a mediator or as an employee for your other fellow employees or coworkers, but if you don't have the tools to demonstrate that behavior or to show them, and this is what we kind of work on here, you know, it doesn't always come naturally, so you need to keep that in mind. And people are not always born with diversity sensitization and conflict resolution capacity, so workshops, training, Things like that are really helpful to create long-term healthy and peaceful organizational cultures. I think the takeaways are accurate. I don't know that this study is a great, what's the word I'm looking for? Like the takeaways I think obviously are solid, but I don't know that this study is the best study for the takeaway, if that makes sense. I just feel like the results of this, because they're slanted towards the UN peacekeepers, I'm like, okay, this is great, but like, I don't know. I'm sure one of you can phrase what I'm trying to say better. Yeah, take my word vomit and try and make something out of it.
No, I love it, Alyssa. I am queen of word vomiting. But I'm hearing what you're saying, and it's like yeah, it's just, can we trust the methodology and the data that was gained from this study? I mean, yes, I like the key takeaway. It makes sense, right? The key takeaway, right, having a third party facilitate things and is typically always going to like lead to greater gain in different capacities, right? And of course, Pollack Peacebuilding Systems, we like to hear that too, because that's what we do, right? We are the third parties kind of going in, and I think especially, well, and I'm trying to think even more. I would love to look further into the study, but a lot of UN peacekeepers, they actually are community members that are in that role. So,
oh, interesting.
Not all the time is it like, you know, an international person coming in. So, I mean, some, yes, absolutely, but a lot of times, no. A lot, especially with peacekeeping, they will kind of employ local community leaders, or, you know, so it might be biased, but not as extreme as we might be thinking, as far as like, oh, this is a completely outside perspective kind of thing, on some American coming in to and you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I think that's an important point to make, that oftentimes the UN does utilize the kind of networks and influences of community members. I think it leads to better conflict when you have local community members who are trying to help facilitate these dialogues, as opposed to having a bunch of, like, for lack of better words, white people come in and be like, this is how you should do it.
Yeah.
Particularly because of, like, you know, imperialization and like colonialism, like doesn't always end well. So I definitely think that's a very good point. I do still think that it's important. I know you agree with this as well, to like keep in mind that I would have been surprised if the results were anything other than this, just because like of where it came from. Not to mean that they aren't valid or that they don't have some, you know, valid applications. And I do think obviously, like, when you give people tools, they're going to be able to do something better. So like if you teach people how to resolve conflict, they're going to get better at resolving conflict. Pretty much, you can guarantee that. So I do think, you know, I like it. I do think it has some setbacks that could decrease I don't want to say legitimacy, but I think they kind of create doubt. But ultimately, I do think this, and I mean, yeah, the results of this we obviously like, because it demonstrates the need for what we do, which I think is important.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, can you just go back to, I can see, I'm trying to find the article on our page.
Oh, I can, hold on, here you go. I got you. I can just send it to you over the chat. That's easier.
Okay.
I beat you to it, sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alyssa.
I had it like right open.
So what I find, I really agree with everything you guys are saying, and it's I think it's so true. I wanted to see, so one of the parts of this study too was, I like you guys are saying, like the accuracy of these results could be questionable, but but I imagine there is some accuracy involved, considering like intergroup dialogue, I feel like tends to help improve communities in conflict. One of the things that they also mention here is that these dialogue activities can reduce negative feelings and biases towards outgroups by providing a space for positive contact between the different members of the groups. And so what they emphasize here is providing that consistent space. And one thing that I think could also be a key takeaway here as well is but providing that space on a consistent basis. The study emphasizes the importance of that local, everyday, or peacetime effort to avoid escalation and war between communities. So having something that's kind of there consistently, that instead of it just being, and I think this relates somewhat to our services too, like in some of our peace building services and all of that, like you need an ongoing presence and ongoing work, presence in order to help conflict, work itself out. Like I think that can start with maybe some individual training, helping people understand how to deal with conflict, but in a long-term case and trying to resolve conflicts systemically as well, and implementing new systems, as well as just improving the culture of the organization. You need that consistent effort of someone, and often it's a third party, helping these organizations or people know how to deal with their conflict, a space where they can relay their conflict and their frustrations to that person, and then finding ways to do that. So I find that as an interesting takeaway here as well, because the consistency and the everyday peacetime making efforts, I think is important.
Yeah, absolutely. And the who's involved in that, right? It's like who's brought to the table, that's there on the ground every day. And that's why I wanted to go back to, because I'm like, I could have sworn that the title was something about how bottom up approaches, right? And it is, because this study was looking at, we're talking about a national entity, and rather than going to governments and like higher ups, like the top down approach, they're saying let's work with the local leaders on the ground and involve them for how things are going. And it makes, applying that to the workplace, it's like how many times do we work with entities that we acknowledge that there are systemic challenges, but there's also kind of the interpersonal, like there's both happening. And so we look at that, and we go in and we do, Noah, how you point out, like it could be trainings, it could be like individual coaching, all while also so we do that kind of on the ground work with the bottom up approach, like the study is talking about, but then also keeping in mind the larger systemic challenges that are almost feeding into that, or not necessarily feeding into it, but enabling all those smaller interpersonal issues from continuing. And so handling both, like either simultaneously or like, starting here and then getting here, I feel like that is the best approach, right? Mm-hmm. Rather than immediately going to, in this case, the government to create some type of like a law or something, but it's like, okay, well, who's going to follow that, unless you're working, and as you point out, like on a regular basis to help you follow that regulation or law or whatever it may be. Right.
Yeah, it's like the difference between you, like you're talking about conflict management, conflict resolution, and then conflict transformation, which is your the conflict transformation side of things, where you're more focused on embedding, or creating a new system or tackling the current system over a long-term period. That's kind of what conflict transformation at least revolves around. And so, yeah, it makes me think of that, and how that's kind of, it not only solves the problem, that the current interpersonal problem or management problem or whatever that you're going on, but it's helping solve future problems by enacting that change in the system, and that is done by a third party. And I think the bottom up, and how like you said, how it works in terms of bottom up could be in different ways, but it's the long-term consistency that can make a difference. And I think Anna Priya mentioned somewhere along in this article about this being somewhat of a conflict reconciliation sort of model, and sort of as a a method of reconciling the parties as because of this consistent effort that they have in peacemaking in these communities. So, yeah.
And as you were talking, I was thinking like the whole third party approach to it. I think it would be, not saying it's impossible for someone within an entity, an organization or whatnot to be able to see both the larger and the smaller perspective, but I just think it's it's more likely that a third party will be able to like look at it strategically from the system, like the bird's eye view, but then also on the like talking to employees, individuals one-to-one to hear their perspective and see both, right? And like look at it more holistically. It's a lot easier for a third party to do that than it is for someone within who's emotionally attached to whatever the challenges are that are happening.
Yeah, you'd have to, if you wanted to do it from within, you'd have to either have like a person from both sides working together to try to make that happen. And it had to be like a long-term, like you'd have to work internally a lot first to really, and that's why I think a third party is a lot more helpful, because that outside perspective brings a lot of clarity to the situation.
Not even just out of sight, but just out of, I mean, you are emotionally attached to even a workplace conflict. Like it might be something that seems very minuscule that, you know, but you have a relationship with someone who is disagreeing with you. So even though you might think that I can think strategically, I can have a peaceful approach, it's less likely because you are way more attached than someone else. I mean, like we are all professionals in this field. That doesn't mean that we don't have conflict with our friends and family and other people that we're around, you know, it's still always a greater gain when someone else is offering a different perspective and helping facilitate whatever it is that, you know, you're working through with someone who you have that relationship already. Yeah,
that's so true. Really applicable to, again, really applicable to our services and what we do.
Yeah.
Which is good.
Yeah, I mean, that is the point of these,
yes.
You know, staying up to date on research is to help us either reevaluate or rethink the way that we perform our services.
Exactly. Yeah, and this validates kind of what we're doing, which is good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.